So very exciting topic, how data transformation is impacting the role of customer success. Yeah, we've had, the basic health scores, the NPS scores, we have our QBR policies. There's a whole new world though coming across with deep predictive analytics that can predict churn, that can anticipate upsells, that can enable reps to find the best opportunities in their install base. I'm joined today by Sanjeev Sisodiya, who was previously VP of Customer Success at Postman, oversaw the growth of that business from less than 50 employees to over 500, and over a period of 5 years. This is going to be a very thought-provoking session. I've had multiple conversations with Sanjeev over the past few weeks, and super impressed with his understanding of not only how this function works, but given his deep engineering background as he started out his career, understanding how data works and impacts different processes. So Sanjeev, over to you. Maybe share a quick introduction of your background and your role at Postman before you left there.
Yeah, nice to meet you, everyone on the call, and Asim, thanks for the opportunity. Really looking forward to the conversation. So as you said, yeah, I joined Postman right around when the company was just below 50 people. Very early in the revenue journey. And, my job there was really to build out the customer success team and the processes, both in support of kind of the broader go-to-market, but also as Postman was building an enterprise product. Over the course of that journey, got to build a lot of the surrounding infrastructure in GTM, including kind of beginning with the support team, building out customer success, early enterprise sales, and solutions engineering. But I think even more relevant to kind of this conversation was the supporting both data and process infrastructure for all of those teams. And Postman was a particularly mature company, even at 50 people, around data infrastructure on the product side. And so I felt like I needed to kind of be a good corporate citizen and build that equivalent sophistication on the GTM side. And we made some really good progress, and looking forward to getting into that. And I think kind of a fundamental thing looking backwards that happened was that we kind of brought that data-centric mindset that was already there on the product side of the company to GTM. Anyway, so looking forward to kind of diving into the details of that.
Yeah, well, let's go right there. I think, and for those of you not familiar with Postman, it is a platform for building APIs, very popular amongst startups and companies at scale as well. And obviously saw pretty rapid growth as in the time frame that Sanjeev, you were a part of that organization. So let's talk about that. What blew me away is you mentioned that there was a pretty sophisticated infrastructure from a data standpoint in the product team when you joined. It was only about 50 employees at the time. And usually what we find in our interactions with startups and other companies that we talk to is that typically the data infrastructure starts to fall in place once companies hit 10 to 12 million in ARR. That's when they start thinking about hiring a data analyst, a data engineer, et cetera. And a lot of these resources are already in place at Postman. So what was different about the culture, or what was different about what sort of led to where that investment was considered important even at that early stage of the company?
I think a couple of things. I think Postman was very much of the generation of companies that is kind of SaaS native to a large standpoint, and cloud native. And so the infrastructure to some degree inherently existed. But I think the other part that's super important, and part of the reason that I joined the company, was that it had a product-led growth / self-serve motion already working really well. And effectively, that data infrastructure was already there because that's how the product team was using, what the product team was using to determine, as they launched capabilities, were those capabilities getting adopted? How were they impacting the growth? So I think it was built inherently as a part of this product-led growth SaaS motion. And I also think the current generation of founders are all very attuned to the value of that data. Right now, it's obviously becoming more and more clear as we look at things today and what's happening in the world of AI. But I think there's an increasing awareness of the value of that data and making it accessible. So, Postman made some very early choices about ensuring that any system that was adopted, any platform that was adopted, had the ability to send data to its central data warehouse, right? And that was kind of a foundational principle that existed, again, before I started there, and kind of allowed this data to be available at the time that it was needed.
Yeah. So I think it's a really key point that companies that are in a product-led growth motion see the value of how the product's being utilized by their customers, and then therefore, excuse me, instrumenting the product to figure out, how the product usage data gives them signals into driving conversion or upsell, et cetera. So when you came in, you sort of picked that up and brought some of that same infrastructure and discipline from a data standpoint into the GTM function. So talk to us a little bit more about that. What were kind of the early days like? We'll come back to the more mature, recent processes, but what were the early days like from a GTM standpoint?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the early days, first off, I really started with the focus on support. That was the first team that existed. And, again, I think we all inherently understand the value of some of the data that's in the world of support, but we don't necessarily get very far down that path of leveraging it. So, one of the early areas was really looking at the signal that we were getting from support. And some of it was very organic. There were inbound leads that came in through the support channel. But others that we were trying to do was really understand what were the themes that were happening from a support perspective. So I think, I think it's really important to kind of take a view of what are the existing data flows and what can I observe out of them that will help us think more completely about what our customers are experiencing. So we really started, and this was a continuous journey over the entire time I was there, because support data has this double-edged sword of being really valuable, having a lot of interesting signal, but also being potentially very unstructured, quite messy, not clean, and not well connected to the revenue data and other things. So that was the kind of the first thing that we tried to do, and I think a version of this existed before I started, but really there was effectively a bot that took the incoming kind of domain context of the signal of the support ticket and enriched it with data from commercial side, which plan the customer was on, those sorts of things. And we kind of tried to lean into that a little bit more, to use that to kind of segment prioritization of tickets and those sorts of things. So that's kind of where we started.
Yeah.
And that taught us a few things that we kind of built on from there.
Yeah. So I think the part I'm curious to learn about is, you mentioned that you were able to identify some lead signals in that interaction from a support standpoint. Tell us a bit more about that. What were the signals, and then how were you able to communicate that and translate that into business?
Right. So, the interesting things were that if you look at things from the support agent's perspective, their goal and their job, what they're metriced on, are resolving the tickets, right? And getting customers to resolution, and then we would send out a CSAT survey at the end of every ticket, kind of standard support stuff. But what they weren't necessarily attuned to was, for example, who was the person that was writing it, right? That was less important to them than solving the issue. So one of the first things that we started doing was just sort of tracking titles of people that were writing in, or longevity, number of interactions. And some signals were explicit. Very often we would get in, because we didn't really have a go-to-market team at that time. Probably the first 6 months when I started, a lot of the expansion requests came in through the support channel, because there was no other channel.
Yeah.
Right. And so observing those initial ones, we started to kind of see that, yeah, it was typically, not surprisingly, more senior titles that would make those requests. So then we started sort of segmenting out leads that came based on title, right? And just giving them an additional review, and then even kind of starting to pass some of those over to what was starting to form from a sales perspective. And very often the idea wasn't even that this is a formal lead, but this is something for you to inspect to determine if it becomes a lead, right? So there was really that just bringing a degree of commercial awareness and review to that support data that was sort of the beginning of that journey.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So I think that was pretty insightful, that like the value really was around the kind of leads were really around expansion in an account. So that makes sense. Now, in terms of the data infrastructure, maybe talk us a little bit more about what was the data infrastructure that was already available on the product team. So you mentioned data warehouse, but what was the tech stack and what data sources were feeding into it? And then what were the additional data sources that were then plugged in to create a GTM signal, that helped sort of drive either growth or expansion in accounts?
Yeah. So from a tech stack perspective, as you said, there was kind of the data warehouse and the product usage data that was already kind of in that context. And then additionally, beyond that, we started integrating in kind of the support signal, and also sort of engagement from the customer newsletter, the marketing data, all of that sort of coming together to expand kind of the customer part of that signal. So pretty classic tech stack in terms of the Postman was an AWS shop, so most of the backend infrastructure is in AWS. I think there was an evolution in terms of the BI platforms, from Power BI to Looker to the more modern tools. And then on the GTM side, while we played around with a few different tools, eventually it sort of settled down on kind of Salesforce as the predominant platform on the not just for sales, but actually for customer success and solutions engineering as well. And then from a reporting perspective, as I said, we primarily ended up using Looker for kind of that information. And the interesting part really was not so much the tech stack, but the process of asking questions and whom you ask questions to. So there was a data team that was working within the product team.
Yeah.
And we didn't really have an equivalent team on the go-to-market side. And we played with a couple of different structures. Initially, there were a few folks in the core data team that were assigned to GTM. And that ended up, in a couple of different iterations, but not really working too well, because they were still kind of predominantly sitting with the data team, didn't have the context of GTM, weren't sitting in the GTM conversations in terms of planning or review. So eventually we tried embedding people. That worked a little bit better, but not really great. And eventually, we made the call to start building a GTM data team effectively within the RevOps function.
Got it. So I think the journey that you described is incredibly valuable. We see this time and time again with a lot of companies that we talk to, where the core data team either starts in the product organization, or typically starts in the product engineering organizations. Then they kind of start to embed analysts in different business functions as the company scales. And then there's sort of this pull towards creating additional data teams, and sort of goes back and forth depending on the stage of the company and the political climate, I guess, in the company. What are the pros and cons of the two different models, where you experience both, where you have an embedded person in the team, and then you also have, eventually you built out a data team yourself? So there's pros and cons in both directions. How would you sort of call it out, a couple of things that are important?
Right. So I think the clear pro of the sort of the embedded person from the core data team is velocity in terms of the tech stack, right? And being able to get things built out, whether it's data flows or reports, because they're very familiar with that platform and the model and kind of how things are architected. So velocity is great. The challenge is the feedback loop. And I think it's actually very often, at least in our case, it was the fault of the GTM team. This happened more times than I can count. We would ask the data team for something, right? And then they would give it to us. And then we wouldn't go back and close the loop with them of whether that data ended up being valuable or not. So, whether it was, hey, segment the data this way so we can look at this category of customers. And then we would take it and go do whatever we needed to do with that. But it never got back high enough on our priority list to go back and tell the data team, hey, this was the value or not the value of that data, right? Because we're all moving so quickly. So I think the feedback loop is really hard to establish in that context. The other way around, right? It's kind of the inverse, right? Which is it takes a little bit longer to get things done because your data team is less familiar with the tech stack necessarily, at least early on until they get more experience. But because the other thing that we did is made sure that the folks that were on the kind of GTM data team within RevOps were sitting in the renewals meeting and the forecast call and the CS review calls. And so they had a ton more context, and they inherently saw, because they were participating in it, that feedback loop. Right. And so they effectively, rather than having to be asked for information, were generating ideas because they were in the flow of the GTM side. So I think in the short term, it was slower velocity, but over time, it became a faster velocity thing. So I'm at least in the context of the experience of Postman, I'm a much bigger fan of having them embedded, even though the cost can be a little bit higher because obviously you're duplicating some resource. But I think in the end, it improves both quality and velocity after a little bit of investment.
So Sanjeev, that's a really good, explanation that you just kind of shared about the reason to do this. Now, I'm curious that in this case, certainly there was a new team that was established in the GTM side. I'm curious that were both teams operating off the same data warehousing infrastructure, or did you end up creating, a GTM data warehouse separate from the product data warehouse? Because that leads to a lot of disconnected, the kind of constant thing that we see in a lot of companies we talk to is you've got multiple teams, but they also have different tech stacks and data warehouses. And then there's this disconnect between who's got the right data.
Yeah.
You get into internal discussion. So how do you?
Yeah. So fortunately, no, we didn't create a second warehouse. And partly it was because we didn't have the resources or the talent. And even if we had thought it, I think, the product side and the overall leadership was mature enough to know that was eventually going to cause problems. So we ended up never explicitly making that call. It was just inherently, hey, the data already exists here. We're going to leverage it. Even with that, I think it's challenging because the front end teams were predominantly using Salesforce. And so we did have, and then we had, a BI platform. It was originally Power BI and moved to Looker. And even with just, all core data coming from a single data warehouse and then us syncing data effectively to Salesforce, that itself was challenging enough. So, it took us a long time to actually get that right and figure out what data under what cadence. And there were some pieces of data that were actually the source of truth was Salesforce, right? And now you had that data syncing to the data warehouse in the background, and then you were bringing data back from the data warehouse to Salesforce, and you had to be careful not to clobber the source of the data. So I think it was challenging, even kind of going unidirectionally. So fortunately, no, we didn't duplicate. And I would say you're absolutely right. That's potentially for a much larger organization, a different discussion, but in early to mid stage, I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Got it. Okay. So maybe changing gears a little bit, a lot of organizations that are currently in that stage of where customer success is sort of the relationship-driven side of things. You kind of see three different models with CS teams. They're either very relationship-driven to where they know who's who on the customer side. They understand, how to connect the dots between the different organizations on the customer side. But they're not deep into the data side of things in terms of how they predict where there's potential risk or there's potential opportunity. Another model we see is what you just described, where it's very data-driven, and there's an investment in the data infrastructure and so on. And then therefore, a lot of focus on the data side, but then, are they equally savvy from a relationship standpoint? And then the third sort of model that I see is where CS teams tend to be very product knowledge heavy. And so they invest their time and resources into how to help the customer overcome any product challenges and adoption issues and so on. But it's more, the dominance is on the product knowledge and not so much the data. So from your perspective, how do you see teams that are relationship driven evolve to more kind of a data-driven model? Like, what's the journey that they need to embark on?
Yeah. And I like that characterization in those three segments. And I think the really great teams learn how to balance all three over time, right? Yeah. I think obviously historically, I think customer success is really focused on the relationships and the product knowledge, and the data piece has kind of been a lower priority. I think clearly, ultimately, the expansion of an account relies as much on the customer getting value from a product as it relies on you establishing a strong working relationship. So I think those are critical. But I think the thing that's coming into the mix that makes the data piece absolutely fundamental is the scale of organizations. And with SaaS, the pace, if and when you get to good product market fit, you end up with a really large distribution of customers. And I think Postman was not unique in this regard without any other large scaling organization, where you've got a handful of really large customers and then a massive long tail of mid to smaller customers. And the dreaded exercise that you do either yearly or quarterly of segmenting these accounts and then assigning them to CSMs. You always end up with this kind of segmentation of, okay, we're going to have this set of premier accounts, 10 to 20 per CSM, bulk of the revenue is going to be there. And then we're going to have this set of scaled accounts, whatever you end up calling it, that's 50, 100 to 200 per CSM. The 10 to 20 model, you can manage, right? Yeah. You can manage through spreadsheets. But, SaaS allows for and encourages, and I think it makes it a healthy business to have that long tail.
Yeah.
The only realistic way to make those CSMs successful is to give them that data infrastructure and that set of dashboards, right? Because they're effectively playing portfolio manager, right, across a large set of accounts. And without that supporting infrastructure of signal, who do I pay attention to now? They're not going to be able to touch every one of those 100 accounts on a, even a weekly basis, right, or a monthly basis sometimes. So I think that's what is forcing the hand is that as much as every CS leader that I've talked to has that mix, right, to varying degrees. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the part that's driving that data awareness, and the need for data is ultimately, how do you make those CSMs successful? One, and also, how do you tell your CFO and your leadership the structure of the CS team and how you're allocating resources? Right? Mm-hmm. And for both of those, you need to be data driven. And I think that's kind of becoming the clear requirement, right?
So Sanjeev, I think the need to be data driven obviously is clear to most organizations. Maybe take us through a little bit of the journey, right? So is it the RevOps team that takes the lead initially? What kind of skill set do they need on the team? what kind of data infrastructure, is there an evolution there that happens? And especially since you've been through that evolution over 5 years, like what did the early days look like, and what does the more mature function look like?
Yep. So that's super interesting. The early stage, and I'm a big believer of this, that I think fundamentally CS leaders themselves need to be heavily data driven. And, of course, you're building relationships with key customers and those sorts of things, but I think it has to start from the top. And both in terms of how you view your customer set, but how you also determine where to pay attention. So early on, we were taking usage data, which was available from the data side of the house, and mixing that in with the commercials, right? And very early on, it was spreadsheet driven, just like most early enterprise data. And eventually, we were able to kind of translate those spreadsheets into a core set of customer success oriented reports that were part of the larger reporting chain. And then, we would report those to leadership and up to the board. So I think, and I think the really interesting part of this is that it's not always clear which pieces of data are going to be the predictors of success. So I think, there's a lot of discussion around health scores and how to think about them. But before that, even you get to, do you even understand the trajectory of your core customers, right? Mm-hmm. So that was the first part for me, was understanding, as I came into this business, it was already a running, growing business. Understanding current trajectories was the first sort of set of data questions to answer before you even started thinking about segmenting and assigning health. So that was very manual, either spreadsheet exercises or basic reports. We built out kind of core SaaS metric reports that, that world is fairly well understood now, what the core metrics are: NRR, lifetime value, gross retention. And we both had an existing tool that provided some of that data. I think for us early on, it was Baremetrics. There was a platform for getting overall SaaS data. Eventually, we started kind of replicating some of that in our own context to build on top of. And this was, so a lot of this early on was myself and a couple of the data folks in the core team building this out before we kind of made the call to start building out a team. At the time, we didn't have a RevOps team. And so we started out, kind of bottoms up with a couple of analysts and a couple of folks on the Salesforce side, which was, again, our front end system of record. And then it kind of organically grew up from that to what is now a full-fledged RevOps team. Because I think you have to be careful to scale that investment with the revenue growth. Right. Because it can be very, very expensive otherwise.
Yeah. You brought up the expense of this a few times. And in fact, one of the value props that we hone in on from an Immersa standpoint is the fact that we can deliver the solution at a tenth the cost because we're doing it repeatably for multiple companies, very much what you just described. But I'm curious, obviously, like hiring data engineers or data analysts is expensive. How did you think about ROI to justify the investment, right? I mean, obviously, in a PLG context, it's almost like a no-brainer, but there still's got to be some thought about how do you think about ROI? Keith, thank you for joining. And for those of you on the call, if you have any questions, please drop in with your questions. Let us know, and we'll keep rolling. So back to you, Sanjeev. Tell us a bit more about how do you build a business case for this?
So I think it was kind of two areas that help justify the ROI. The first was that, effectively we knew we were going to grow the GTM organization as a whole, right? And customer success, sales, solutions engineering. So we knew there was kind of an expense, a scaling expense coming there. That was going to be much larger than the investment that we were going to make on the data side. And so to some degree, one way to justify it is really that we want to make sure that we make appropriate investments in those functions. And in order to do that, we need to have a good handle on kind of existing growth trajectories and segmentation. So I think part of the justification really came from being data-driven, right? And saying, hey, in order to scale the GTM function appropriately, we need better data, right? And so I think in that way, it was seen as an investment against future spending to make that future spending more efficient. And so that was one. And then the second that was kind of a little more prosaic was, the central data team already had a long roadmap of their own that they needed to build out, right? And while they were being good corporate citizens and supporting us, it was always a bit of us kind of stealing their time for our needs, right? And it wasn't, so it was more of a question of alignment and making sure that we could move as quickly as we needed to. And I think for Postman, the investment was more straightforward because although it was relatively early, the trajectory of the business was pretty well established in terms of growth. And so I would say had a little bit of the luxury of not getting a huge amount of kind of pushback on the spend because there was kind of that fundamental momentum of the business. And I think that's something that you need to balance. And that's why I think in the early days, I played data analyst for a little while because that's what it called for at the time.
Got it. Okay, so everybody's favorite topic now, health scores and customer health scores, right? So if you use any CS platform, you're familiar with those. Every company has some way to quantify what the relationship with their customer looks like. How did you go about it at Postman, and how much of it was, I'd say, objective and data driven as opposed to sort of relationship and subjective data? And what are some of the limitations and opportunities here?
Yeah. This is definitely a tricky one, and we all struggle with it, right? Like, I think there's the promise of the health score as this simple way to identify how well a customer is doing, and I don't think it ever truly delivers on that promise without some kind of human filter on top of that. So we played with a few different ones, but eventually, we settled on something that was very, very basic, which was effectively active usage, right? And so we would, because, clearly when early stages of adoption, your Postman, and I think like most SaaS tools, was a seat-based product. And so early on, you just want to make sure that the actual base licenses are getting consumed. And then over time, the ones that are consumed, are they actively being used, right? And so we had a fairly basic active usage metric. What percentage of licenses are actively being used on a month-on-month basis?
Yeah.
And we tried a few things that were more sophisticated than that. They really didn't provide a huge amount of incremental value on top of that fundamental. So my belief is that, the more the simpler you can make the health score, the better, right? The degrees of sophistication don't really add a lot of incremental value on top of that. And then the second piece is, again, sort of to state the obvious, I think that works well. Something simple like that works well for the scaled CS segment, right? Where you're really doing portfolio management, and you have a budget in terms of your churn budget or growth budget, whatever you want to call it, and you can manage with a simple score against that budget across a portfolio of accounts. For the enterprise segment, whatever you want to call that, ultimately, the revenue in that account this year is a small down payment on what you hope it grows to over years. And that growth is probably 60% going to be, in my opinion, at least in the early 3 or 4 years, going to be driven by the relationship you have with that account as much as it is by the usage, right? And so there, we asked CSMs, enterprise CSMs, to make a call on the state of the account. And we had 3 or 4 different categories, of kind of account health. And I think we did eventually end up tying them to a renewal signal, right? And saying, what is your projection for what's going to happen at renewal? But effectively, it was a call on the health of the account. And the CSM was responsible for updating that on a quarterly basis. So you had kind of a basic health score that was usage-based, and then the CSM's call that could be it could be in alignment, or it could be completely opposed to that health score. And we kind of use those to determine, when we were doing account reviews, where we needed to pay attention.
Got it. Sanjeev, I know we could continue on this particular topic for a long time. There's so much to unpack here, but I think that the 2 key points that I took away, there's usually some consumption pattern that correlates to a renewal event, whether the customer's going to renew and upsell, et cetera. And then the first 3 or 4 years, it is very relationship driven. So don't lose sight of that. I think both of those are really important points. Okay, so I'd like to take this home at this point and see if there's any questions from the audience that you'd like to bring up. Sanjeev, if people wanted to reach out to you for advice or conversations, what's the best way to approach you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's the way we all talk to each other these days, or connect with each other. You can find me there, and yeah, I'd be happy to chat.
Awesome. And so, for those of you who joined us today, thank you for your time. And the recording will be available by the end of the day tomorrow, that you can share with your colleagues and friends. If you enjoyed this session, join us again next week. We are going to start diving really deep now into the statistical approaches and the analytical approaches to understanding data for customer success. So our next 2 or 3 sessions will center around those topics, with very exciting guests coming up. Sanjeev, thank you for your time. I really appreciate your coming in today and sharing all the insights that you did. You've obviously had a very exciting journey with Postman, and we've learned a lot from our interactions with you, and look forward to continuing the conversation and growing kind of knowledge base in the industry. Okay, thanks everyone.